Hello and welcome back to Up the Villa podcast. I've got a special guest for you today, Kieran Maguire, football finance expert from The Price of Football. How are you doing, Kieran?
I'm as good as can be following a 0-0 draw at home on a Monday night, which is what I watched last night at the Amex.
Yeah, to be fair, Wolves actually played quite well, I thought.
They're decent side,
yeah,
and they're very technical.
Yeah, very, very good. So we're going to kick it off then. I want to find out from you all about Aston Villa financially, off the pitch. On the pitch, it's going very, very well. But something that's sort of giving football fans a big fear is what's happened to Everton, Nottingham Forest, etc. And it's regarding FFP. So my first question for you is probably one that you get asked all the time. So what are your thoughts about FFP? Is it just a mechanism to protect the elite, or is it for the greater good of the game?
It's a bit of both, but it's mainly to do with trying to ensure that we don't have another Chelsea or Manchester City who get new owners, can spend huge sums of money and become a competitive threat for those clubs who were used to winning the Premier League, but more importantly, qualifying for the Champions League every season. So in my view, the rules are flawed. They've not reduced losses. If you take a look at the Championship, the average losses in the Championship, 470 grand a week. Take a look at the Premier League, 18 clubs out of 20 are losing money. So it isn't creating profitability, and it's not creating sustainability either. You look what happened to Chelsea when Abramovich got sanctioned by the UK government. Chelsea weren't that far from going out of business. Everton have had a lot of trouble. They had a new owner come in, put in a lot of money, and then his circumstances change. At Derby, the owner put in £200 million, and his kids are saying, "Dad, that's our inheritance that's going down the toilet on average players." So it's not preserving the football, and it's certainly not there to prevent another Bury or Macclesfield from taking place.
Yes, it leads me on to my next point. So Villa and Newcastle appear to have wealthy owners who want to invest. Why is this loss treated the same way as a club living beyond its means without the financial cushion of wealthy owners, such as like Leeds in the 90s?
Because the Premier League clubs have voted for a set of rules that make it very difficult for new owners to come in. If you take a look at Aston Villa, for example, their most recent wage bill, £137 million. Well, that's £200 million less than Manchester United. It's thick end of £250 million less than Manchester City. It's £200 million less than Chelsea and Liverpool. And they can't really spend much more. So that means that they've either got to be a lot smarter in terms of their recruitment, and fair play to Villa. They have, as a Brighton fan, that 6-1 defeat at Villa Park didn't flatter us at all. We were absolutely tated. So Villa have got where they are through playing good football, but it does make it more difficult because you then those bigger clubs able to offer the bigger wages. The average wage at Villa, compared to some of these other clubs, is it's a good night out. I'm not denying that, but it's probably around about 70, 75 grand a week, and you've got clubs offering far more than that.
Yeah, so Villa seem to be especially in this window. We seem to have gone down a little bit of a different path. We are looking at, and it's to do with Monchi coming in with his obvious scouting network and how he sort of sees his vision of Aston Villa. So, in January already, we look like we're going to be signing a lot of youngsters. So, next question for you then is, Villa seem to be targeting expensive young players, with the suggestion being that this will go through as youth expenditure, thus will not count towards FFP. What are your thoughts on this, and what is the cutoff for a youth player? So could sort of like Bellingham be classed as a youth player when he went for all that money to Real Madrid?
If the player is in the academy, then academy costs are exempt. So if you recruit another player, effectively using EPPP, the Elite Player Performance Plan, and you give a little bit of compensation, and we're talking tens of thousands, then that's exempt from FFP. If you sign a player who is already on a full-time contract elsewhere, those costs are treated as normal costs. But again, you're picking up the player on a cheap basis. I suspect what Villa are doing is what many clubs in the Premier League are now doing. I'm not blowing smoke up my club's arse, but we've seen the success at Brighton and Brentford, where they've deliberately targeted younger players. They give them a couple of years and they sell them on for a bigger fee. I think Villa are starting to use that. They've got an advantage for 3 years. The sale of Jack Grealish in 21-22 has given them a bit of flexibility for 3 years because of the way that FFP works. And I think they're starting to use some of that money as an advantage. They've certainly invested huge sums into the transfer market. If you take a look at 2019-20, 156 million, followed by 101, followed by 204. They spent large amounts, and now they're probably saying we need to take perhaps a slightly different model to go forwards further.
Yeah. So how do Villa bridge commercial revenue, the gap? It's so important for FFP. Even like mid-table teams in London have significantly more commercial revenue than Villa.
You make Villa sexy. You make Villa attractive. You make Villa a name that sponsors and commercial partners want to be associated with. And the trouble that you got is you can't do that overnight. The London clubs have an advantage because many overseas owners like the idea of flying into London, Gatwick or Heathrow, and going to watch a team or their team. But if Villa are successful, and if you take a look at commercial income, last season 21-22, it was the highest in the club's history. It is 3 times the amount or twice the amount where we were a decade ago, but there's still a big gap here. 39 million pounds Villa's commercial income. Manchester City are generating 300 million. Why are Manchester City generating 300? Well, first of all, they've got 1 or 2 connections in the Middle East, but secondly, they've got trophies. And when you talk to sponsors, when you talk to commercial organizations, they want to stick their product next to a trophy or next to a footballer that everybody wants to get their hands off. And in the case of City, they've got Jack Grealish, they've got Erling Haaland, they've got Kevin De Bruyne. Can you match that in terms of what you can offer your commercial partners?
So, I mean, Villa this season are going really well. 4th in the league. Look like hopefully we're going to get Champions League football. So would that tie into like Champions League, like getting in that and sort of like being able to grow that way?
Yeah, Champions League is a real game changer. Villa in Europe this season, and the Europa Conference. It's great if you're a fan. You're going to these different places. You're not going to make any money realistically unless you get to the semi-finals. By the time you've paid for your transport costs, your accommodation costs, player bonuses, you don't get very much money in the conference. Champions League, you're probably kicking off with a minimum of 30 million pounds in the bank, and you make progress. You get £2.5 million for a victory in the Champions League, whereas you get a tenth of that in the conference. And you will have bonuses from sponsors, but all of a sudden people are going, "Oh, it's Aston Villa, I hold it." And then you can say, "Well, yeah, that's not just Aston Villa; it's Aston Villa, former winners of the European Cup." And and I'm old enough to remember watching that match live when the whole country wanted Villa to win, with the exception of Blues, which is you'd be disappointed with any of your Blues mates if they wanted you to win. So I think the club can leverage off the back of that, but it will take a long time for that 39 million to become 60, to become 80, to become 100, because you don't have owners who have the same connections that Newcastle do, for example, in Saudi Arabia. So it's going to be tough, but qualify for Europe, and you've got more matches, you've got more sellouts at Villa Park, you can charge more money to the hospitality, to the prawn sandwich munchers, and for all the criticism we level at them, that they pay the big bucks when it comes to football.
You spoke about making Villa sexy. Villa are in the process of rebranding, having a new badge. We've got 150 years sort of coming up this year as well. Do you think that this would have an impact on future revenue? Like if Villa have a rebrand or not?
If I'm honest, probably not, because we have seen sort of what you might say relatively cosmetic changes historically. Is it right that Villa are moving to Adidas from Astore? Again, that potentially can happen, but I don't want to be rude to Villa. Adidas look at their clubs and they say, well, we've got tier 1 clubs. So in the case of Adidas, it's Real Madrid, it's Manchester United. So you're going to be a tier 2 club. Newcastle are moving to Adidas as well. So you're fighting for the affections of the manufacturers. It can make a little bit of a difference, but if I'm honest, it's a bit like if Fairy Liquid have got a new logo. You either buy Fairy Liquid or you don't. It doesn't really make a lot of difference to the punters.
Yeah, cool. Right. So hot topic of Villa fans anyway. Something that's happened this season is that we've had 2 concepts inside the stadium, one called Lower Grounds and one called the Terrace View. Both are classed as not corporate, but something like add-on bolt-ons that you can add on to your ticket, which you pay a bit more. You get like sometimes in Lower Grounds, you get all-inclusive food. Terrace View, you can get a seat or you can get a season ticket with it. So this comes on to like corporate revenue though. So similarly with corporate revenue, Villa seem to be a long way behind London and clubs based in the Northwest. How do Villa address this? Is the location of Villa Park an issue?
It's not perfect, but if you've been to Old Trafford, if you've been to the Etihad, they're not great locations. And I lived in Manchester for 4 years, so I think it's a sign that the club is thinking outside the box. If you take a look at Villa's match day income, it was £16 million in the last set of accounts. Well, Manchester United got 130. Spurs will probably have 120. Liverpool are going to be hitting 100 now that they've increased the capacity of Anfield to 61,000. So Villa have an awful lot of catching up to do. And provided it doesn't disenfranchise the Villa hardcore, the people that have been going to the whole end since they were 7 years old and will be there to the day they die. As long as you don't disenfranchise those people, then the two can live side by side. If you take a look at what we're seeing at, when Spurs expanded their stadium, a lot of the tickets went to the corporates. But when you see how much of an impact that's had on Spurs finances, Spurs were generating £35 million a year at the old White Hart Lane from ticket sales. They'll probably be generating somewhere between 110 and 120, and that's not going to be coming from the lads and lasses who are hardcore Villa fans. So you've got to attract that alternative market, and I think that Villa are acknowledging their existence with these opportunities and these slightly different products.
Yeah. Do you think it's necessary for Villa to go down that road?
It's a horrible thing to say, but I think it is. Because otherwise, how do you compete? Or do you accept that we are Aston Villa, and what we're going to do is that the extent of our ambitions is that we're going to try to be top 6, top 7, and our aim is to get Conference, Europa League, which is still great fun. But if we win, and you got the owners, you think about Wes and Naz, they're billionaires in their own right. Would they accept that? Villa are probably punching slightly above their weight at present, in my view, because they've got probably the 8th highest wage bill, and they finished 7th last season, 4th at the present. They're doing all right. Is that enough for you?
For me,
Yeah.
I want to see Villa absolutely massive and competing with, the big boys and sit around that big table of like the top four and stuff. So when I look at like the terrace view and the lower grounds as a fan, I realise that it's needed, because that's how I can see Villa closing that gap. That graphic you put on your Twitter feed, I think a couple of weeks ago, and it showed Villa's like match day compared to everybody else. We're lagging so far behind, and something's got to give. Something's got to give for us to close that gap. So
I think you're
I
right.
think
it's an evil, but it's a necessary evil to a certain extent.
Yeah, and I think as a proud Villa fan and somebody that absolutely loves the club, and you can look at history and can look at heritage. So I think sometimes key decisions, those decisions have got to be made, and if it's for the good of Villa, I think sometimes you've got to just think, you know what, we've got to just do it. Unfortunately. So my last question, I've got two more actually. So the last but one then. So Aston Villa were going to have a new North Stand. We were going to knock the North Stand down, rebuild it, have a new club shop in there, more corporate. Chris Hex come in and said that, we're not selling 200 seats, and that's the reason why it's not going to happen. It's going to take a long time. It's going to take about 2 years. And if we get Champions League football, we don't want to sort of like a 3/4 full stadium. What are your thoughts on this? Of us not sort of just biting the bullet, doing it for the future rather than now? It feels to some Villa fans that it's a very short-sighted decision not to do it.
I must confess, I'm broadly in agreement with them, because it does seem short-sighted. If you take a look to see what Spurs did, they had 2 years at Wembley, but they have tripled the money that's being generated from ticket sales. They've got Beyonce there for 7 nights. They've got the NFL. They've got Anthony Joshua, or whoever it is, fighting. And it has transformed the club. And if we're honest, if you've got the 8th biggest budget, you're going to finish on average 8th. Mm-hmm. Now, by not expanding the stadium, how are you going to go from 8th to 7th to 6th to 5th and so on? Because, again, history and heritage. I first went to Villa in 80-81, and it's not changed much since then. And I don't have an issue with that. But when I put my finance hat on, I'm going, well, how are we going to generate more money out of this? So it is that conflict. It does. I can't understand, because by not doing it, you are effectively saying to Spurs, we're going to give you a minimum of an extra 2 years of having that 80 or 90 million pound financial advantage over Villa. And if it then becomes 3 or 4 years, we're talking, 300 million pounds, 400 million pounds of a benefit. That's an awful lot of catching up you're going to have to do. Should the ground eventually be expanded? My view as an outsider, you know Villa far better than I do, of course, Luke. Villa can sell out 50,000 a week. Newcastle can do 60,000. Villa can do 50,000. And you've got to grow to stand still. Otherwise, the gap between Villa and Newcastle, what happens if Leeds go up to 50,000? Because then they've got relatively owners. They're talking about it. The longer you leave it, the bigger the gap becomes.
Yeah. So finally then, how would you summarise on how Aston Villa are doing, how they are, and what would you say the general consensus with our finances are? So do you think that sort of we're okay? And in the summer, would we be able to spend a decent amount of money?
I think Villa have to be a little bit cautious. I mean, they've sold some academy players and got decent profits from those, which have been beneficial. this is the last year that the benefit of the Jack Grealish sale goes into the equation. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the summer, because I think we're going to move to a new FFP variant where Villa will be allowed to spend a proportion of their money generated on wages. Well, if Villa have got 18 million pounds of ticket sales, 70% of 18 is what, about 14 million. Manchester United have got 130 million worth of match day ticket sales. 70% of that is a big number. So can you see by not moving forwards in terms of the expansion of the club's revenue base, it does mean that the wage gap and the player investment gap is going to continue to grow. So will the club have a bit of flexibility? Yes, they will. Can they spend the 200 million pounds that they spent in 21-22? I don't think so.
Cool. On that bombshell, then, that is it from us today. So, Kieran, it's been great chatting to you. Great insight, and you've answered my questions perfectly. So, thank you for coming on, Kieran.
Thanks for the invite, Luke, and all the best to the Villa for the rest of the season.